The British establishment just got hit with a bombshell they never saw coming. Rowan Atkinson, one of Britain's most beloved and respected entertainers, has just done something absolutely unprecedented. The man who made millions laugh as Mr. Bean and Blackadder has just delivered the most scathing, most devastating, most brutally honest takedown of Keir Starmer and his government that we have ever witnessed from a public figure of his stature. This isn't some politician attacking another politician. This isn't partisan mudslinging. This is one of Britain's greatest cultural icons standing up and saying what millions of ordinary Brits are thinking but don't have the platform to say. And what Atkinson has revealed in the past 24 hours has sent absolute shockwaves through Westminster and across the entire nation. We're talking about explosive accusations of governmental overreach, systematic attacks on free speech, and a Prime Minister who is fundamentally betraying the values that made Britain great. Atkinson didn't hold back. He didn't soften his words. He didn't worry about being politically correct or protecting his career. He spoke the truth with a clarity and courage that has stunned everyone who's heard it. The mainstream media is scrambling to contain this story because they know how damaging it is. When someone as universally respected as Rowan Atkinson speaks out against the government, people listen. When someone who has spent decades making people laugh suddenly gets deadly serious about threats to British freedom, people pay attention. And what Atkinson is warning about should terrify every single person who cares about liberty, democracy and the future of this country. Starmer's government has been quietly implementing policies that Atkinson describes as the most dangerous assault on free expression in modern British history. Laws that criminalise speech, regulations that give government unprecedented power to silence dissent, a creeping authoritarianism that's being disguised as protecting people from harm but is actually about controlling what British citizens can say, think and believe. Atkinson has been fighting against these threats for years, long before Starmer came to power. But what's happening now under Labour's watch has pushed him to break his usual silence and speak out in the strongest possible terms. The interview he gave 2 days ago has gone absolutely viral. Millions have watched it. Millions more are sharing it. And everyone who sees it is reaching the same conclusion. Rowan Atkinson just exposed Keir Starmer as an authoritarian threat to British freedom. And he did it with facts, evidence and moral clarity that cannot be dismissed or spun away. This is the moment when one of Britain's most treasured public figures stood up and said, enough. Enough lies, enough government overreach, enough attacks on the fundamental freedoms that define what it means to be British. Stay with me because what I'm about to reveal will show you exactly why Atkinson's intervention is so important and why Starmer's government is so desperate to make this story disappear. Let me give you the full context of what triggered Rowan Atkinson's explosive intervention, because this story has been building for years and it perfectly illustrates the authoritarian direction Britain has been heading under successive governments, now reaching its most dangerous point under Starmer. Atkinson has long been one of Britain's most articulate defenders of free speech. Many people don't realise this because they only know him as a comedian and actor, but Atkinson has a degree from Oxford University and has been involved in free speech advocacy for decades. He's particularly concerned about laws that criminalise speech, especially the kinds of vague hate speech regulations that give government enormous power to prosecute people for expressing opinions that authorities deem offensive or harmful. Back in 2012, Atkinson was instrumental in campaigning against provisions in the Public Order Act that made it a criminal offence to use words that were merely insulting. He argued that free societies must tolerate speech that offends or insults people, that giving government the power to criminalise insults inevitably leads to abuse and censorship. His campaign was successful and that particular provision was repealed. But the underlying problem never went away. Successive governments have continued to expand hate speech laws, creating more and more categories of protected characteristics and making it easier to prosecute people for speech. And now, under Starmer's Labour government, this trend has accelerated to an absolutely terrifying degree. In the past 6 months, Starmer's government has introduced legislation that dramatically expands what counts as hate speech, creates new criminal offences for online communications, and gives police unprecedented powers to investigate and prosecute people for things they say on social media or in private conversations. The specific legislation that finally pushed Atkinson to speak out is called the Online Safety and Responsibility Act, though critics are calling it the Censorship Act because that's what it actually does. This law gives government regulators the power to force social media platforms to remove content that authorities deem harmful, hateful, or dangerous to public order. It creates criminal penalties for individuals who post content that could potentially incite hatred or cause psychological harm to protected groups. It requires platforms to implement monitoring systems that can identify and flag problematic speech. And it gives police the authority to investigate and prosecute people based on complaints about their online communications, even if those communications were in private messages or closed groups. The implications are absolutely chilling. Under this law, a person could be criminally prosecuted for expressing political opinions that someone finds offensive, for making jokes that authorities decide cross the line into hate speech, for sharing information that government considers dangerous misinformation. The standards are incredibly vague and subjective, which means enforcement will inevitably be arbitrary and politically motivated, and the penalties are severe, including potential prison sentences for repeat offenders. This isn't theoretical. This is actual law that Starmer's government has pushed through Parliament despite vocal opposition, and Rowan Atkinson watched this happen with growing alarm because he understands exactly where this leads. He's studied history. He knows what happens when governments gain the power to criminalise speech they don't like. It always starts with seemingly reasonable restrictions on the most extreme or offensive forms of expression. But it never stops there. The power to censor is always expanded. The definitions of what's prohibited are always broadened. And eventually you end up with a system where people are afraid to express honest opinions because they might face criminal prosecution. So Atkinson decided he had to speak out, and he did so in an interview that has now been viewed by millions of people across Britain and around the world. He didn't just criticise the Online Safety Act, he delivered a comprehensive indictment of Starmer's entire approach to governance, free expression and individual liberty. He started by explaining why free speech matters, not just as an abstract principle, but as a practical necessity for a functioning democracy. Atkinson pointed out that throughout history, every major advance in human rights, every successful reform movement, every correction of injustice has required people to say things that made the powerful uncomfortable. Abolishing slavery required speech that slaveholders found deeply offensive. Women's suffrage required speech that challenged prevailing social attitudes. Civil rights movements required speech that authorities tried to suppress as dangerous to public order. If you give government the power to criminalise speech that causes offence or that authorities deem harmful, you're giving government the power to prevent the kind of dissent and advocacy that drives positive social change. This isn't about protecting the right to be cruel or bigoted. It's about recognising that you cannot have a free society if people must constantly self-censor for fear of criminal prosecution. And that's exactly the society that Starmer is creating with his authoritarian speech laws. Atkinson then turned specifically to the Online Safety Act and explained in clear terms why it's so dangerous. He pointed out that the law gives incredible discretion to government regulators to determine what speech is acceptable and what isn't. There are no clear bright line rules. Instead, there are vague standards about causing harm or inciting hatred that can be interpreted almost any way authorities want. This creates what legal scholars call a chilling effect, where people avoid expressing opinions, not because those opinions are actually illegal, but because they can't be certain whether they might be prosecuted. When the law is vague and enforcement is unpredictable, rational people choose silence over the risk of criminal liability. And that's exactly what Starmer's government wants. They want people to be afraid to criticise government policies. They want citizens to think twice before sharing information that contradicts official narratives. They want a population that has been trained through fear to self-censor, to stay quiet, to comply. Atkinson called this exactly what it is, authoritarianism. Not the crude authoritarianism of jackbooted thugs smashing down doors, though the law does give police new powers to do exactly that in extreme cases, but the sophisticated authoritarianism of bureaucratic control and pervasive surveillance that makes people police their own thoughts and speech. It's the kind of authoritarianism George Orwell warned about, where the most effective oppression comes not from external force, but from internal fear. And it's happening right now in Britain under a Labour government that claims to be progressive and democratic while actually implementing some of the most regressive and authoritarian policies in the democratic world. But Atkinson didn't stop at criticising the law. He called out Keir Starmer personally for betraying Labour's historical commitment to civil liberties and working class empowerment. He pointed out that Labour was founded as a party to give voice to ordinary people who lacked political power. It was supposed to be the party that defended citizens against overreach by the state and the powerful. And now, under Starmer, it's become the party of state control, the party that wants government to have more power over what citizens can say and think. The betrayal is profound and it's personal for many Labour supporters who believed their party stood for freedom and justice. Atkinson also addressed the practical impact these laws are already having. He shared examples, names obscured to protect people from further prosecution, of British citizens who have faced police investigation or criminal charges for social media posts that expressed political opinions or made jokes that someone found offensive. A man prosecuted for posting a meme that mocked a political figure. A woman investigated for expressing gender-critical views that transgender activists found hateful. A teenager visited by police for sharing information about immigration that authorities deem potentially inflammatory. These aren't hypothetical future scenarios. These are things that are happening right now under laws that Starmer's government has either introduced or aggressively enforced. And the message is clear: the government is watching what you say, and if you step out of line, there will be consequences. This is state intimidation designed to create a climate of fear and compliance. And it's working. People are already self-censoring. They're deleting old social media posts. They're avoiding controversial topics in online discussions. They're teaching their children to be careful about what they say because speech can have legal consequences. Britain is developing a culture of fear around expression. And that culture will take generations to undo, even if the laws are eventually repealed. The damage Starmer is doing to British society extends far beyond his time in office. He's fundamentally changing how people think about their rights and their relationship with government. He's teaching a generation of British citizens that freedom of speech is conditional, that expressing unpopular opinions is dangerous, and that government has the right to control what you think and say. These lessons, once learned, are incredibly difficult to unlearn. And that's why Atkinson felt compelled to speak out so forcefully, because he understands that what's at stake isn't just current policy, but the future of British liberty itself. The reaction to Atkinson's intervention has been absolutely explosive, and it reveals just how deeply the British public shares his concerns about government overreach and threats to free expression. Within hours of the interview being published, it became the most shared political content in Britain. Social media platforms were flooded with people expressing support for Atkinson and anger at Starmer's authoritarian policies. The hashtags defending free speech were trending nationwide. Millions of ordinary Brits were speaking out, many for the first time, about their fears that Britain is losing the freedoms that made it a great nation. And here's what makes this moment so significant. These aren't partisan political activists. These are ordinary citizens from across the political spectrum who recognise that free speech protects everyone and that government censorship threatens everyone. You had Conservatives and Liberals, Labour voters and Tory voters, young people and old people, all united in supporting Atkinson's message and opposing Starmer's authoritarian agenda. This is the kind of broad-based popular opposition that governments fear most. because it can't be dismissed as partisan or fringe. When people from all backgrounds and political persuasions agree that government has gone too far, politicians have to pay attention. The establishment media's response has been revealing and disturbing. Several major outlets barely covered Atkinson's interview at all, despite it being one of the biggest stories in Britain. Others covered it, but tried to minimise its significance or question Atkinson's motivations. The Guardian published a piece suggesting Atkinson was out of touch with modern sensibilities about harmful speech. The BBC brought on commentators who argued that some restrictions on speech are necessary to protect vulnerable groups from hatred. These are exactly the kinds of responses you'd expect from media outlets that support government censorship and want to delegitimise anyone who opposes it. But the attempted media spin isn't working, because millions of people watched or read Atkinson's actual words and they could judge for themselves whether his concerns were legitimate. And the overwhelming consensus is that Atkinson is right. The government has gone too far. The laws are too vague and too broad. The enforcement is already being abused. And if this continues, Britain will lose the free speech traditions that have been fundamental to British identity for centuries. The political opposition has seized on Atkinson's intervention as validation of their own criticisms of Labour's authoritarian tendencies. Conservative MPS are pointing to Atkinson's words as evidence that concerns about free speech aren't just partisan attacks, but legitimate worries shared by respected public figures. Reform UK has made Atkinson's defence of free speech a centrepiece of their campaign messaging, arguing that they're the only party truly committed to protecting British liberties. Even some Liberal Democrat MPs, despite their party's historical support for hate speech laws, have expressed concern about how far Starmer's government has gone. The political landscape is shifting, and free speech is becoming a defining issue that cuts across traditional party lines. And within the Labour Party itself, there's growing unease. Backbench MPSers are hearing from constituents who are worried about the new speech laws. Civil liberties campaigners who traditionally support Labour are expressing alarm. Even some cabinet members are privately questioning whether the government has overreached, though they're not willing to say so publicly while Starmer maintains control. The internal tensions are real, and Atkinson's intervention has made them impossible to ignore. Starmer's personal response to Atkinson's criticism has been characteristically defensive and tone-deaf. In a brief statement, the Prime Minister suggested that Atkinson doesn't understand the complexities of modern governance or the real harms caused by online hate speech. He claimed the Online Safety Act is necessary to protect vulnerable people from abuse and harassment. He insisted that the government remains committed to free expression, while also ensuring that speech doesn't cause serious harm. It was the kind of mealy-mouthed, have-it-both-ways response that politicians give when they're trying to defend the indefensible, and it satisfied absolutely nobody. Critics pointed out that Starmer didn't actually address any of Atkinson's specific concerns about vague standards, arbitrary enforcement, or the chilling effect on legitimate speech. He just repeated the same talking points about protecting people from harm without acknowledging that giving government broad censorship powers creates far greater harms than the problems the law supposedly solves. The response made Starmer look defensive, evasive, and fundamentally unserious about civil liberties. It reinforced exactly what Atkinson had been warning about, that this government doesn't actually value free speech and will always prioritise control over liberty when given the choice. But perhaps the most significant aspect of this entire controversy is what it reveals about where Britain stands right now as a society. For too long, people have been afraid to speak up about government overreach because they feared being labelled as extremists or bigots. The culture of self-censorship was already taking hold before these new laws even passed. People were already policing their own speech and their neighbours' speech, already reporting people to authorities for expressing wrong opinions, already accepting the premise that some ideas are too dangerous to be allowed.